listening to the Reformand Initiative podcast, where we analyze and discuss Roman Catholic theology and practice from an evangelical perspective. My name is Clay Kennard, and I'm joined here in the city center of Rome with my brothers and colleagues, Dr. Leonardo de Chirico and soon-to-be Dr. Reed Carr, we hope. As we mentioned on our last episode, Reed's working on his PhD. So if you prayed for him, thank you for that. But we've got another episode today where we're going to discuss a Vatican File again. Today is actually May 2nd is when we're recording this. And so yesterday, as usual, right on time, Leonardo's latest Vatican File was published. And it should be a very helpful and interesting topic. And I'll pass it over to you, Reed, so you can describe why that is.
Yeah, thanks, Clay. It's helpful, I think, and hopefully our listeners will find it interesting and informative. It's a discussion that should be familiar to the Reformand Initiative and our listeners. It has to do with the nature-grace interdependence that we discussed for the first time way back in, one of the first three episodes, probably either episode 2 or 3, and have spoken about it since. And it's extremely important because it forms it's part of the backbone of the Roman Catholic theological system. We always talk about Roman Catholicism as a theological system and not a theology that can be broken up into many different aspects and then put back together in a way that we find fit. But it stands on these theological pillars, and without them, the entire theology of the Roman Catholic Church crumbles. And one of those is the nature-grace interdependence. And in case some of our listeners are new, it'll be helpful just to give a brief summary of what that is and what that means and why it's important. But today, what we want to do is discuss what Leo writes about in his most recent Vatican File, which is kind of a historical trajectory of that interdependence. We always talk about Vatican II, and rightly so, and Roman Catholicism in light of Vatican II, which is absolutely necessary when we talk about modern day Roman Catholicism. But it is also important to understand that this nature-grace interdependence did not originate in Vatican II. It's kind of the historical trajectory of the Catholic Church, and it's always helpful to know that and to understand how it got to where it is today. And so in this article, Leo discusses that historical trajectory coming up to contemporary times. And I believe next month, will it be the more contemporary discussion of that, Leo?
Yes, hopefully so.
Okay,
yeah.
so we'll be able to discuss the more contemporary development of that and the debate that has occurred recently on that topic. But just like it is important for an evangelical to understand its historical roots, and to know that it's just not some modern invention.
Yeah.
That's with almost any theological doctrine, is to understand its historical roots and trajectory, which gives you a better understanding of it and an appreciation for it, depending on what you're discussing. But I want to start this discussion in the same way that Leo starts his Vatican File. And it's interesting to note how the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is a pretty big book, that came out in 1992, is a collection of all the Roman Catholic teachings on various doctrines. It was in the papacy of Pope John II, and very helpful for understanding Roman Catholic theology. But in Part 1, Section 1, Chapter 1, the title of that is Man's Capacity for God. And that's a loaded statement, a loaded theological statement with humongous implications. Man's capacity for God, which sets a trajectory. It sets a foundation for the entire discussion which follows and the entire development of Roman Catholic theology. How you understand that, what is man's capacity for God, sets your theological trajectory on everything: sin, salvation, your understanding of Christ, his atoning work on the cross, everything. And Leo starts his article off saying, the 1992 Catechism of the Catholic Church begins with a section interestingly entitled Man's Capacity for God, and deals with the foundational issue, and here's what it deals with, which is key, of whether or not men and women are naturally open to God and recipients of his grace. That's why this discussion is so important. if when we talk about man's capacity for God, the response is, yes, man is naturally open to God and to receiving his grace, that sets you on a specific trajectory. If your response is no, he is not naturally open to that due to sin and what the devastating effects of that are, that sets your theological trajectory. But Leo highlights that the Roman Catholic answer to that question is a resounding yes. Yes, man is naturally, even in his sinful state, open to God's grace and receiving it.
Yeah, Reed's looking at me smiling like, what are you thinking, Clay? And the reason is because I'm sitting here looking at Romans chapter 3. Oh. Yeah. We can come back to later if you want.
For sure. So, and that's where the nature grace interdependence comes from, is how this relationship between nature and grace. So before we get into kind of how that developed historically, Leo, could you give us a brief summary of what is the nature grace interdependence and why is it so important?
Yeah, it's one of the two axes of Roman Catholic theology that sets the stage for the whole structure and of Roman Catholic belief. And as you rightly said, there is the assumption that man, and by man it is men and women, the human being, the human person, the human persons are naturally endowed with this openness towards God. And in affirming such a statement and belief and conviction, the whole impact of sin is undermined or overlooked or minimized, not in the sense that it is totally not recognized. There is a Roman Catholic doctrine of sin, and quite a complex and articulated one. But in the end, this ontological statement, man is capable of God, man is open to God, remains and is maintained despite the consequences of sin. And out of that openness, which has not been undermined, let alone destroyed by sin, what comes after that is dependent on it. So grace is seen as something that you receive, but you are inherently capable of receiving it, responding to it, collaborating with it, and the whole framework of Christian belief is then given a specific direction away from the historical biblical ground motive of us as having been created in the image of God, and in a sense we were in that state of being capable of God or capable to be open to God in Adam, as the historical Adam. But then sin intervened, and that capacity was broken.
Yeah, the Catholic word they use repeatedly is wounded.
Yeah, but wounded, is a metaphor taken from the language of the body, and which maintains the fact that you're weakened, you are wounded. There is something wrong, but not at the expense of having lost the natural capacity. It is maybe less pronounced, less performative, but still there. Whereas in the historical, biblical ground motive of creation, sin, and then redemption, the importance, the gravity of sin implies that that openness is no longer there unless God reopens it from His side and ultimately sending His Son to reopen it. But on our part, that capacity is lost. We are, as Clay said in Romans 3 and Ephesians 1 and multiple other biblical texts, we are fallen, we are dead. That's a metaphor. That is not the metaphor of wounded, of a little scratch, but it's a mortally poisoned, dead kind of metaphor.
There's a metaphor working on kind of studying this doctrine of sin in Roman Catholicism for our conference this summer, and a metaphor that explain, I think it's helpful here, is that if you think about a soldier who's in battle and he's wounded in battle, depending on the gravity of that wound, he can still continue to fight and maybe even defeat his enemy, depending on the gravity of it. And this is a similar way of how sin impacts nature in Roman Catholicism. It wounds it, which means that yes, it's affected by it, but it still has its capacity to perform its function. Whereas the more Reformed tradition says that soldier is killed in battle and is totally incapacitated and needs something to revive that life.
Yeah, it's about regeneration. The language of the Bible is regeneration, new birth, which implies that there is no life, spiritual life, before, unless and until God reignites the life there that is no longer there. So the language of the Bible is clear: regeneration, new birth, instead of just curing and healing. That's also part of the biblical metaphors, but grounded on that foundational truth that in Adam we were all created and we all sinned to the point of losing our spiritual life, our spiritual capacity for God, unless God reestablishes it.
You mentioned really helpfully in your article how that, and you've kind of hinted at it here, but this distinction between the Roman Catholic understanding of nature and grace and sin and creation, because when we talk about nature, obviously that is including everything in the created order, which mankind is included, but that differentiates from the Reformed tradition, where you see a distinction between creation, sin, and redemption. But in Roman Catholicism, nature and sin are incorporated.
Yeah.
How can we understand that in a more simplified way?
Yeah, because sin is a wound.
Right.
It is not something radical that has undermined, has totally changed and broken creation. So it becomes part of it. Our wounded nature is still open to God. So sin is not given that fundamental weight in the Roman Catholic framework. And so it is included rather than being considered as an important step of this ground motive. So we have creation, sin, redemption. The Catholic Church has nature, grace. So sin has become part of nature, but not undermining its inherent openness. And in so doing, it swallows, in a sense, sin into nature, not recognizing the importance of sin in destroying, in breaking, in overturning the natural order.
You use a helpful word in your article, saying how nature and within the Roman Catholic system, since nature and sin are together, because there you have the nature grace as opposed to creation, sin, and redemption. So nature is naturally receptive to grace, whereas in Roman Catholicism, which is a very powerful or weighty term, that it naturally receives it, whereas according to the Reformed tradition, it naturally rejects it in its devastated state. There's no receptive connectivity there. That line was broken. You think of a telephone line or something, how a signal can still be received even if it's been damaged a little bit.
Even in the evangelical Reformed tradition, there is the recognition of the importance of common grace, the fact that God in His goodness and kindness bestows His grace in order for created life to function, even if threatened by the evil consequences of sin. But that doesn't mean that we are naturally a recipient of His salvific grace, of His special grace. That is something that was lost in the Garden of Eden by Adam, our representative, and the only hope for us to restore that openness is through the new Adam, Jesus Christ. That is something that is not fully appreciated by Roman Catholic theology, which still thinks that as created beings, we have residual openness to grace, and out of that openness, God then infuses His grace, but presuming and infusing that grace in that capacity that is still there. So not regenerating, not bringing new life, but just using the means and the tools that are already there and are still there. So that creates a very different framework for the whole of the Christian message to be understood and appreciated.
Well, that's a good summary of the nature-grace interdependence, and hopefully, if you're listening, the implications of that are very clear. Again, we were talking about how this sets a foundational trajectory for all of theology, and again on the doctrine of sin, which we can discuss in more detail soon. The doctrine of soteriology, how we're saved, Christ's atoning work on the cross, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the time to discuss this now, but help us to understand how the Catholic Church arrived at that understanding. Again, it wasn't just something that came about recently. It's part of its historical narrative. Where do we start, and where does it start, and how do we get to where we are?
Yeah, well, that's part of the content of the article that tries to summarize, a long and at times complex historical trajectory. But in a nutshell, I think we should be aware of some confusions in the early fathers, talking about grace, talking about nature, but oftentimes talking about nature and grace as applicable to people who were already Christians. So thinking about how grace works in our already Christian life. So we're open to grace because we are Christians. And that is something that needs to be taken into account. Oftentimes the fathers were not talking about men and women in their natural Adamitic state as implying opposition towards God or against God, but they were talking about men and women as already Christians, and therefore grace impacting their lives, and them being open to grace. That was a confusion, that distinction not always being clearly defined. And thinking about the then majority Christendom that came out of the Constantinian era, theologians began to think about humanity as naturally Christian. And so thinking about men and women as already Christian, because they would belong to a Christianized world. And that the issue of sin becoming more and more less underlined as a radical problem of humanity as such. And that was the confusion that led to the growth of this nature-grace interdependence. The loss of this confessional view of Christianity, whereby Christians are the believers in Christ, not necessarily those who are baptized, not necessarily those who are born into a Christian environment, but the believers in Christ. Once that distinction was no longer properly defined, then the issue of nature and grace became a continuum, and the problem of sin was gradually put on the periphery of their attention. And then, of course, you end up with the great systematizer, or the great systematizers of the Middle Ages, when this whole trajectory finds a presentation that is much more clear and defined than in previous generations, in previous centuries, where the fathers were blurring categories, were confusing. At times they had ambiguities in their thought. But when it comes to the Middle Ages, Bonaventura of Bagnoregio and Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great and others, they categorized this interdependence into well-defined concepts, nature and grace. And sin was lost, swallowed in nature at that point. And the whole system was then twisted into leading to a very different direction.
And you speak about the patristic age at the kind of start your trajectory there. No, what would be some important names of these early? You mentioned early church fathers. Who would have been important names in this discussion?
Yeah, Irenaeus, Augustine, with many good points, of course, and but oftentimes still beginning to think in terms of a majority type of Christianity and not distinguishing between the natural man, a sinful man separated from God, and the Christian man in a state of grace, because they were working and operating in a time when Christianity was becoming majority. They would not always distinguish between the natural man and the Christian man. And then in the East, the Cappadocians, and they continue to work with that assumption that when they talked about nature, they were talking about Christian nature as applied to anthropology, rather than distinguishing the nature in Adam and the nature in the new Adam. That's key. If we lose that distinction, we end up in a bigger confusion. We add confusion to confusion. So Augustine had this idea of biblical idea of the depravity of man, the radical impact of sin. So there were hints and important discussions there, but not to the point of changing the trajectory to becoming, to realizing the crucial importance of distinguishing between creation, sin, redemption. But that creation-sin distinction was, in a way, blurred to the point of making the two one.
Did Augustine tend to blur that as well? I know he had like you said, he had a better idea of the depravity.
Yeah. No, he was quite clear on that.
Okay.
The gravity of sin, the fact that we are humanitas damnata, damned humanity. Mm-hmm. That's what humanity is. Not open to God, but actually close to God, and terribly so, unless grace opens it up. Mm-hmm. So he was, but the main trajectory did not take the Augustinian point to change the direction that he was taking.
Instead, it took Thomas Aquinas'
It took
understanding.
This progressively blurred view of nature and sin to the point where then the scholastics they then outlined a whole system. At that point, the system had solidified. Up to that point, the fathers were using, the patristic and the early Middle Age fathers were using ambiguous terms at best. But it was the scholastics who actually then came up with a theory, with a fully defined theology, and that has become the standard early modern and contemporary position of the Catholic Church.
So the Catholic Church, just to be clear, as far as Augustine, it adopted his understanding of sin in the sense that it is inherited.
Yeah.
Augustine also taught on the depravity, but that did not inherit that aspect of his understanding and teaching of sin, but more adopted the scholastic. I mean, that was built on what you've already.
Yeah. The limit of Augustine was that he had a biblical doctrine of sin, but then he had confused ideas on how then grace comes to us, because he was, living in an age where Christianity had become largely majority. He had this idea that through baptism, that regenerating power of God would occur. Mm-hmm. And so all the baptized people were Christians, whereas this is not the case. I mean, he had a biblical doctrine of sin and important aspects of a biblical doctrine of grace, but then this idea of baptism as regenerational and the church as the sacrament of it confused this system in various ways. Less so than other fathers, because he had a strong view of sin. But the Reformation was needed in order to, in a sense, set Augustine straight and direct the whole Christian trajectory into appreciating the biblical categories and the biblical ground motif of creation, sin, redemption.
Is it fair to say, and we'll conclude with this, obviously so much more could be said on this, but your article will be a good starting point for our listeners to go to and learn about this historical trajectory of this important concept in Roman Catholicism. But is it fair to say, as the Roman Catholic Church of today looks back historically, is there a particular figure that would be the most important to them?
Well, Thomas Aquinas is the great Roman Catholic scholastic who defined, solidified, cleared, clarified the whole nature grace. And out of Thomas, there have been many readings of Thomas, and many versions of Thomism, but basically all revolving around that account given by Thomas. And even present-day discussions, they still wrestle with Thomas in one way or another. But after Thomas, that's the trajectory of the Catholic Church.
And it's helpful as the last comment to keep in mind when we talk about Thomas Aquinas, the scholastic or the scholastic theologians. Of course, the scholastics were those theologians who tried to marry reason and philosophy with theology. And Aquinas, for example, was greatly influenced by the philosophy of Aristotle. Some were influenced by Plato more, but so that certainly impacted and shaped their theological convictions that have been adopted largely today by the Roman Catholic Church. And you said just a moment ago that in the 20th century we've seen a significant theological debate over this exact interpretation of Thomistic understanding, and I think maybe you'll elaborate more on that in the next article. Is that correct?
Yeah. God willing, yes.
We'll hopefully discuss that. But so anyway, it's thank you for your article, Leo, and again, it's always helpful to understand these historical trajectories so we understand where we are and how we arrived at the points where we find ourselves. So we appreciate it and look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Reed, and thank you, Leo. We really appreciate this continued work and the research that's taking place. We pray that it will benefit our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world in the evangelical body. So you can find this article on VaticanFiles.org. There's also a form on the website. You can subscribe to the newsletter so that every month on the first of the month at 6 a.m. in the morning, at least Rome time, you will receive this new article. So please get that, share it. I hope that it benefits you. And if it does, let us know. Tell us about how this ministry is blessing you and equipping you to understand Roman Catholic theology and to engage Roman Catholics with the gospel. As usual, share our podcast, leave us a good review, and follow us on social media on Twitter at Reformanda Rome and on Facebook at Reformanda Initiative. Until next time, God bless.